Hi, my name is Bill Schaeffer, and I have a book review. Today's book is The Conquest of Mexico by William Prescott. This is a fascinating book, and it will be very difficult for me to keep this talk short because I could probably talk for 2 or 3 hours about this book. This is an amazing book for several reasons. First off, this book was written in 1843 by William Prescott. Now, William Prescott not only wrote a great book, but he revolutionized history writing. Up to that time, history writing was a bunch of moral object lessons. And when writing about history, it was always written to teach a certain moral point. But William Prescott wrote a book that was just an accurate portrayal of the significant events. And this is an amazing story. I read this book in college and was totally unaware of how old it was. The book reads, for the most part, like a modern book. He writes in a very modern style, and only occasionally are there archaic phrases that are curious. Now, the story itself. The story of the conquest of Mexico is one of the great epic stories of all time. It rivals Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, any Star Trek. It's as interesting as any story from ancient history. It is an amazing story. The central figure, Cortez, would make a great movie character. At 18, he moved to Cuba, an unknown nothing. He married the richest woman in Cuba, managed to get himself appointed to head the third expedition to Mexico. At that time, Mexico was an unknown land off of the island of Cuba. At the last minute, he was removed from the expedition, so he stole all the boats. He stole every single boat in Cuba, sailed them all to another island with the crew that he had paid, finished building the boats, finished outfitting the crews, and then sailed to the Yucatan. Just when he landed in the Yucatan, a previous Spanish explorer who had been caught and enslaved wandered out of the jungle. So immediately, Cortez had a translator. At this point, the Mayan Indians gave Cortez's men 20 servant women. And among them was the woman who's known to history as Donna Marina. And she was the daughter of an Aztec nobleman who was sold into slavery by her mother. And she spoke Mayan and Nahuatl, which is the Aztec language. From her, Cortez learned of Montezuma and the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, a gleaming white city on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. So Cortez and his ships traveled north and landed at what is now Veracruz. So of his 10 ships, Cortez sent 1 ship back to Spain with the formal declaration of claiming the city of Veracruz in the name of the King of Spain. The next morning, he assembled all his men on the shore of the ocean with the ships moored out on the water. And while he was talking, one by one, he had the ships burnt and engulfed in flames, so not a single ship remained. And he told his 120 men that they would conquer Mexico victorious or they would die trying, because there was no escape. This was the same thing that Scipio Africanus did almost 2,000 years earlier in the battle against the Carthaginians. Needless to say, it's an amazing story, and it goes through twists and turns and improbable uncertainties. just getting to the capital of the Aztec kingdom was an adventure. But once there, he encountered Montezuma. Now, history has not been particularly kind to Montezuma, but he was a great ruler of unimaginable power and military prowess. He was revered by his people as a living god and lived in unimagined luxury. But there had been a prophecy that had come down through the ages that Quetzalcoatl would return. And he would return in the year of one deer as a white bearded man. And this is exactly when Cortez arrived. And this knowledge and Montezuma's extreme faith led him to vacillate with uncertainty whether he should fight and conquer Cortez or whether he should just yield. This proved ultimately to be his undoing. Cortez and his army of 120 men were quartered inside the city, so Montezuma could watch them closely. His Indian allies were camped on the shore of the lake outside the city. And for a while everything went fine, until the Spanish soldiers noted that one wall had a doorway that had been covered up. Being naturally curious, they removed the bricks and they found the royal treasury. It was a room that was filled with gold and jewels, and they went crazy. His lieutenants insisted that Cortez kidnap Montezuma to capture all this gold, and that's what they did. So for a year, they lived in this uneasy truce. Now, many things happened up to this point in the story and through the story that I don't have time to tell right here. And I really suggest you read it because every step it's a fascinating story of the clash of cultures. Now, I'm speeding through a lot of significant events that you will enjoy reading about. But at one night, and this was called Noche Triste in history, the sad night, the Spanish, whose forces now had been augmented to about 500 men, decided they had to leave. The Aztecs had become hostile, and they were virtual prisoners inside Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztecs. And so they made a break for it. And as a group, they decided to try and escape over the causeways that connected the city to the land on the shores. The Aztec army put up a valiant defense, and only about a third or a half of Cortez's men survived. Many of them were drowned because they were carrying so much gold with them that when they fell off the causeway, they were weighted to the bottom of the lake. Nevertheless, Cortez and a significant party of his men survived and regrouped on the shore, and they set off back to the east coast of what they called New Spain. They went in a big arc towards the north and ran into this huge mountain on a flat plain. Now it turns out that this mountain was really the pyramid of the sun, which the Aztecs held to be holy and sacred as part of the city we know as Teotihuacan. And presently, this pyramid has been uncovered. It was the pyramid of the sun. But at that time, it was a huge conical mound. And Cortez and his men were camped at the top of the hill. When they woke up in the morning, the Aztec army of about 200,000 men was camped at the base of the hill. Now this is one of the great scenes that would make a great scene in a movie. Cortez grabbed a lance from one of his lieutenants, and he mounted a horse, and single-handedly, by himself, started galloping down the hill at full speed straight for the Aztec army. Since he was alone, and it was so unusual, no one did anything. They just watched him. He rode through the army, right up to the general, stuck the lance through his chest, and killed him, wheeled around, and rode back up the mountain to his camp. This was so startling that the Aztec host disintegrated. They basically fled the scene because it was so unexpected and they had no general. This allowed Cortez a chance to escape to the ocean. There, at the ocean, he got more reinforcements. He built a number of ocean-going boats that he then disassembled and carried back to the center of Mexico for his final assault on Tenochtitlan. Well, as we know, eventually he was victorious, and he managed to destroy the city and conquer the Aztec kingdom and establish New Spain. Now, regardless of what you may think about that event and the legacy of brutality that the Spanish inflicted on the inhabitants of Mexico or New Spain, the story itself is amazing. It's about a single adventurous man who, against all unbelievable odds, with only the steel will and cleverness of his own mind, managed to not only survive but prevail. Ironically, after 10 years, he was removed from being the governor of New Spain. He was recalled back to Spain, and he died penniless and forgotten in a boat off the coast of North Africa. So he did not particularly profit from his adventures, but the story is an amazing story. And if you read it, you will be caught up, and you'll find it's equally as amazing as The Lord of the Rings, as Star Wars, or any epic story that we have written or heard of. Therefore, if you have an interest in history, and you have an interest in epic battles and epic stories, I highly recommend The Conquest of Mexico by William Prescott. It is one of the best books I've ever read in my life. Thank you, and leave your comments below.